Welcome to this presentation on special properties of liquids and intermolecular forces. Let's start off by taking a look at liquids, which are held together by attractive forces between the particles. So that's kind of our key word here, is that between the particles. So when we're talking about intermolecular attractions, we're not talking about bonds like we have in the past, right? We talked about, say, hydrogen and chlorine bonding together. That's different from what we're talking about now. We're talking about between the molecule attraction. So the glue holding these things together, you hear me say that a lot, is the glue between these different molecules. Here's another way that we can look at it. You think about the bond kind of being, I don't know, sewn together, right? Where, say, hydrogen and chlorine, where maybe they're sharing electrons or they're giving and taking electrons, and that really ties them together, right? With this thread and needle kind of example. Well, think of intermolecular forces almost like Velcro. So now we're going to take these sewn together pieces and we're gonna stick them together. But you know, if we think about thread and needle, it's a little more permanent than Velcro, right? If with enough force, with enough energy, we could actually get those molecules to separate again. So if we think from the last page, right, our solid here, if we focus on the solid portion here, in this case, the Velcro is really, really strong. The glue in between those molecules is really, really strong. And the difference is that when we add energy, right, this picture is really showing us increasing energy. Now, those particles can actually slide past one another, which makes them fluid. And we know that liquids take the shape of their container and they have a fixed volume. They don't always fill the entire container. But if we were to continue to add even more energy to this, right, pull that Velcro even further, eventually we'd get to what we talked about in the last unit, which was a gas. So, you know, we spend a lot of the earlier parts of the year talking about solids, and we just got done with the gas unit. So now we're kind of focusing on this middle part, which is the properties of liquids. We're not going to get into plasma, but I like to call it almost like a hot soupy mess, because basically the atoms it's so hot that they kind of fall apart. And so that there is a fourth state of matter, but we really focus on the first three in chemistry. So how can we tell how strong that Velcro is, how strong these intermolecular forces are? Well, one of the ways is through viscosity, and you've probably recognized viscosity without even knowing it. We got a couple of pictures over here on the side of, say, honey. Honey is something that's really, you know, fairly viscous, or something like molasses. Is incredibly viscous. You compare that with maybe pouring out this glass of water. That water comes out so much faster because the honey and the molasses is much thicker. Well, that tells us that the intermolecular forces, the glue holding, say, our honey together or our molasses, is going to be much stronger than something like, say, our water or our milk, is basically what this graph is kind of showing us. The different viscosities, or how thick those different liquids are. So this tells us a little bit about things that we can't see, these intermolecular forces that are going on. In addition to the vocabulary word viscosity, we should also be aware of these two. One is cohesion, the other is adhesion. So they sound very, very similar. And what you need to remember is that cohesion really is two like particles. So a lot of times when we're talking about this, we use water as an example. It's everywhere, and it's just a really nice example. Cohesion would be the attraction between these two water molecules, right? We got these two buff water molecules here hanging onto each other. And then adhesion would be two particles that are not the same, all right? So in this case, our adhesion, this might be, say, a glass container or something, anything that's polar or charged that will grip onto the water. This is showing the intermolecular forces, not only between the waters, but also between the waters and then, say, something else. So a couple of questions to ponder regarding this idea of cohesion and adhesion. is say, why does water bead on a newly waxed car? You know, what's going on there? Well, clearly we have cohesion going on. Those water molecules are sticking to themselves, but they're just really not sticking at all to that car. You know, the reason why people wax their car in the first place is so that water or other polar molecules won't actually stick to the car. It just kind of beads up and you know, easily wipes off, or as they drive down the road, it doesn't stick to the car. Another example of this might be, and I think some of you may have done this in, say, junior high, how many water drops could we fit on a penny? Well, if you look at this picture, you can actually see, I like this picture because we can kind of see that outline where those water molecules are really hanging on to each other. They don't want to let each other kind of go off the side of that penny. And at the same time, underneath that water, it's also, there's some adhesion going on because that water is sticking to the surface of the penny. So I really like this picture because you can just see, you know, some of these water molecules way out here on the edge. Those should be, you know, falling off the side, but they don't, because cohesion, that intermolecular force between water, is holding on to them. Another vocab word you should be aware of is capillary tubes. So capillary tubes occur when water climbs up the sides of basically really thin tubes. So what you're seeing in this photo is you're seeing, this is basically water that's dyed blue, and you'll see that this tube is really wide in diameter, and then as the tube diameter gets smaller, there's really no tricks here. The water level appears to be kind of crawling its way to the top of the tube. And what's happening is that water is moving upward because of capillary action. You can actually see the meniscus. So what's happening is these water molecules, there's cohesion and there's adhesion going on in that tube. I have a little video here of Jackie Chan, and hopefully you can see he's kind of using the walls here. I think of water as the same thing. So that water molecules, if you kind of picture them kind of holding on to each other, and then they're also kind of bracing themselves along the walls of the glass tubing here. They're kind of working their way up. They're walking their way up, almost defying gravity as they work their way up that tube. So one of the applications of this is a process called chromatography. And if you look at this picture that we have here, you can kind of see what color they marked on this is called chromatography paper. What they did was they probably put, say, a green line right there. And what the water is doing that Jackie Chan maneuver. It's working its way up the paper via that capillary action, and what it's doing is it's carrying along with it some of those molecules of color, and we know that the color molecules are different sizes, so they're going to travel at different speeds, and so we're actually seeing those colors actually separate. So basically all they did was they just took, say, a black pen, and you can actually see where that line was, and we could see those mixtures start to separate. We also see capillary action occurring every day. If you walk outside, plants are using capillary action where their xylem, which is a fancy word for basically some really, really fine tubes within plants that they use to draw that water up. Again, defy gravity to get that water all the way to the top so that those leaves don't become dehydrated. There's also a little bit of evaporation going on, which helps pull that water up, but capillary action definitely going on there. And then over here, what we see is you can actually, it's kind of a cool experiment to do on your own if you want to try it out. You get some white flowers, white daisies, whatever, and put them in some food coloring. You can actually see this process. Here they do it with celery, pieces of celery. I think the red one's particularly cool, where it's drawing up those color molecules along with the water that it's sitting in. So a couple of questions for you to ponder on these vocab terms. How does paper toweling work? Bounty, quicker, picker, upper, right? How does that stuff work? Why would we rather have, a 12-pack of this as opposed to our phenomenal paper that we have at school? Well, If you think about it in terms of capillary action, the bounty, you can actually kind of see it right here. If you take a nice piece of paper toweling, what does that have that we really don't see over here? Well, pores, right? That has a lot more pores that allows that capillary action to soak up a lot more water. So, we have a spill on the lab tables at school. We have this brown paper. Why do we have that? Well, look at it. It's coming in bulk. It's probably very inexpensive, but it also doesn't have those pores. So we end up kind of pushing around a lot of the liquids instead of actually soaking it up. So really good example of that capillary action at work. The next term that we want to talk about is surface tension. So again, all these relate to intermolecular forces, but surface tension is really the tendency of liquids to decrease their surface area to the smallest size possible. And that smallest size possible, when we look at the smallest surface area, ends up being a sphere. And so we actually see the forces in between these water molecules pulling on one another. And if you want more information, I'd probably direct you to this link that talks about how the forces around, say, the water molecules that are in the center of the droplet versus the ones that are on the edge, there's a difference in forces kind of pulling. And so if you're kind of interested in the physics of how that kind of works, I think it's an interesting kind of lecture to check out. But for now, we'll just kind of talk a little bit about that glue between the water molecules and how they affect this idea of surface tension. So all three of these kind of examples really deal with this idea of surface tension. So, our little water bug that's kind of walking on the water, how is it able to do that? It doesn't have little water shoes it's walking around on. It's utilizing that surface tension, that attraction between those water molecules on the surface. Now, here's a really good question that you have to think about. Why does pepper float on water? Maybe you've tried this at home. Versus it sinks in ethanol. And what does that tell us about the intermolecular forces? Well, if it floats on water, that means that the surface tension for water is going to be much higher, for H2O, is going to be higher than that of the ethanol, right? Because there's more glue, there's more of those forces kind of holding that pepper on the surface. Versus in ethanol, the forces just aren't that strong, so the pepper just kind of sinks to the bottom. And this is a video. Couldn't get the video to work here, but you can actually take nickels, and if you set them, if you just drop a nickel into water, it'll sink to the bottom. But if you carefully place it with a fork, you can see that nickel they have there does indeed float. So let's talk more about these forces, this glue holding these molecules together. So, for example, when a liquid changes to a gas, remember, temperature is all about how fast those molecules are moving. And so if we're going even in the example from a liquid to a gas, now here's the key thing here. The molecules have enough energy to overcome the attractive forces is what that should say. And you can think about it, it has enough energy now to rip that Velcro apart, to get those particles more and more separated. So how might we tell how strong these intermolecular forces are? Well, we just kind of talked about a few, like viscosity and surface tension. Here's a few more. We could look at the different melting and boiling points. So if the boiling points are higher, that means it takes more energy to get those molecules to separate, to overcome that Velcro, if you will. Vapor pressure we'll talk more about later on in this unit, but it's essentially talking about how many particles really there are in the air. If you look at this kind of picture, it's the how much of this liquid is really kind of evaporating. So if it evaporates less, if you will, and that's actually our next one, evaporation rate. If it evaporates much quicker, well, the glue holding those together is not as strong. And if it's takes a really, really long time to evaporate, that means that we got really, really strong bonds holding those together. So the last thing we want to talk about here are the three different types of intermolecular forces. So we've talked about this Velcro. this glue holding the molecules together. Let's actually look at the 3 types, and you'll see 2 of these are actually review. So ionic forces. We've talked about ionics in the first semester. So oppositely charged ions attracting to each other. Remember, they give up an ion. There's transferring an ion. So say like salt, right, where our sodium ion is losing an electron. Our chloride ion is gaining an electron. So we end up with this positive and this negative, which makes the 2 of them attract. This is the strongest of all forces. This is the king or queen of all of our intermolecular forces. Next, again, this one should be review. We've talked about this idea of polarity. So another way of saying that is dipole forces. So between polar molecules, there it is again, our polar molecules, where we have this positive end of one molecule attracting to the negative end of another molecule. Here's our example. This is just water here, where we have our positive hydrogens, our negative oxygens, and in between these, that is our attraction there. And this is kind of like our, I don't know if you will say medium force. It's kind of in between ionic, and the next one we're going to talk about dispersion. But again, should be review from what we talked about earlier. A special type of dipole force or polar force is something that we like to point this out, a hydrogen bond, because these occur all the time. So when we, like I just pointed out here, these water molecules, in between these water molecules, anytime a hydrogen, especially like in water, where our hydrogen is attracted to an oxygen, or it could be, it's actually a couple of different elements like nitrogen, but we call that, if it's specifically hydrogen bonding, or I want to say attracting to another element, we call that specifically a hydrogen bond. So more questions to ponder. Why does ice have a lower density than liquid water? You think about most solids, say if I have a solid hunk of iron versus maybe molten iron, that solid iron is going to actually weigh more usually than the liquid. But for water, it's different. And so we really need to understand what's going on with the structure of water. Well, for ice, you can kind of see the way that this has the structure of this ice. You see how there's all these little air pockets because those molecules slow down and they make this really rigid structure that can have air kind of locked inside of it. So that air makes that ice float versus our warm water. Now those molecules are moving faster by each other, and they're kind of sliding by one another. So what would water look like without hydrogen bonds? What if there was no glue? Oh my gosh. Oh, we'd be in trouble. Basically, the water that we know as it is today as a liquid, you go to the faucet, you turn on the faucet, water comes out. That wouldn't happen because there'd be no attraction between those water molecules. So it would all be a gas. We'd all be in a lot of trouble. Speaking of trouble, if we didn't have hydrogen bonds, our DNA couldn't stick together. So hydrogen bonds, and if you end up, or I should say when you end up taking biology, or maybe you've taken it already, you'll learn about DNA and how, this is really our genetic code. This is what makes us, and that couldn't exist without these hydrogen bonds that are linking these 2 strands of DNA. So the last force that I want to talk to you about here is called a London dispersion force. And this is the one that's brand new. You've never heard of this one before. But it's found in all materials. All right. So this occurs because all things have electrons, right? So if we think about maybe just these 2, I'm just going to point out these 2 neon atoms here. They have electrons. They're buzzing about. Well, at a certain point, all of those electrons are going to end up on one side. So this is kind of a before and after down here in the middle. All of these electrons, for a split second, just a snapshot, they all end up on one side. So we end up with this, what we call a temporary dipole. So it doesn't hang around for very often, but we see this negative side of the atom, and then also where there aren't electrons is we see that positive side of the atom. So we're creating this attraction, or this, I should say, this attraction is created because just by random chance, those electrons end up on one side of the atom at an instance, and then they're not on the other side. So this attraction between the positive and the negative acts as a quick, momentary glue holding atoms together. So one of the things that we know about this is that if we have more electrons, if we have bigger molecules, we're going to see more of these dispersion forces. I like to think of it almost like ants. I got this weird picture of ants on here. You know, 2 atoms, dispersion forces, not going to be a big deal. But when we have tons of atoms, just like these little ants trying to carry this stick that is way too big for them, you know, if they all work together, now they can carry it. Well, the same thing applies with these elements. If I have more electrons, that means that this momentary attraction occurs way more often, so that it adds up, right? The more ants we have, the more that they can carry. So it's kind of the same thing with London dispersion forces. So in summary, we talked about a few things regarding intermolecular forces. We talked a lot about liquids, and then we also discussed the 3 different types of intermolecular forces, the glue that could be holding these compounds together. So I hope this was helpful, and I hope that you were able to learn a little bit about intermolecular forces.